Hello, and welcome to the East Africa Business Podcast. This show is all about showcasing entrepreneurs who are building businesses in this exciting part of the world. From reading high-level articles about the region, it can be difficult to really understand what's going on. And so my hope is that these interviews somewhat bring it to life, as well as stoking your curiosity to go find out more. On that, do take a look in the archive for more episodes that we've done. But for now, let's enjoy the rest of this funky intro music and then get started with the show. This is a slightly different episode of the East Africa Business Podcast, where we'll be covering a thesis around development. When you consider how countries and societies have spurred economic growth, it has all happened through urbanization. Streams of people moving from rural livelihoods to populate cities where they would find a better life and more opportunities. Underpinning all of this was energy. Opportunities and wealth are a function of economic productivity, and in order to produce more, power is needed to run, say, factories. Historically, this has been generated centrally in a power station and sent out via the grid. This has favoured a society built around these central sources of power and hence led to the rise and growth of cities. Azuri Technologies, however, believes that this same path does not need to be taken in Africa. In this episode, Conrad Whitaker and I discuss macro trends around the continent's development, how off-grid solar can change the paradigm for migration patterns, and ultimately what their view of the future is with the distributed economy. I'd love to hear any feedback you have on this episode. I certainly found it to be one of the most thought-provoking interviews I've done to date, and hence why it goes on for a little longer. Anyway, without any further ado, here is Conrad Whitaker from Azuri. So, we're here today with Conrad Whitaker from Azuri Technologies. Conrad, welcome to the show.
It's great to be with you, Sam.
Cool. So, just to get started, can you tell us a bit about you and a bit about Azuri?
Sure. Well, about me, I think I can explain about me more by explaining what Azuri does and how I fit into that organization. Azuri Technologies is a company that's UK-based, founded in 2012, and we manufacture and provide the service offering of pay-as-you-go solar technology in Africa. So we've distributed close to 200,000 solar home systems in 12 African countries. Our main kind of focal point from where we branch out in Africa is Nairobi, Kenya. And I've been here with Azuri for the past 2 years, focusing mostly on distribution and operations. So I'm a distribution delivery manager for one of our main distributor here in Kenya.
Got it. Cool. And in this episode, we're going to talk a bit about the thesis you have around the distributed economy. But just to sort of, before we get onto that, we'll sort of maybe delve into a bit more about Azuri. So 200,000 solar systems. What's a solar system?
Right. So, let's say solar home systems, really. These are, you have a panel connected to a battery. And with these systems specific to companies like Azuri, these are also connected with integrated appliances. So you have lights, radio, torches or flashlights if you're American, and then very often a USB charger, or most often a USB charger to charge some of these appliances that you might already have, such as your cell phone or mobile phone. And in other cases, the radio and the torch. The higher up the ladder you go, more appliances can be integrated into that system, such as a television, which will often come with content as well, as in a satellite subscription with a local satellite provider. And so our bread and butter, we really can say currently we're distributing two main products. One is a 4-light system coming with a 10-watt panel with a radio and a torch. It'll give you 8 hours of light at night. This system is really meant to replace a lot of kerosene users in rural Africa. So the primary target consumer here is off-grid consumers who are not connected to the grid. And then after, depending, the bigger system we have is essentially the same thing, the 4-light system, which we call the quad. But it comes also with a 24-inch TV and satellite content with a bigger panel, a 50-watt panel.
Cool. Okay. So you are selling, and you basically sell it as a package. So it's kind of, if I'm a potential customer, it's like I can go to Azuri and get a 24-inch TV with satellite, and it will come with, Azuri will come along and they'll pop some circlines on my.
Yeah, what is the kind of reason of being for us? Or how do we define Azuri? It's kind of a service company. We're providing also some finance. And you could see us also a little bit like a utility. So yes, we're providing power to someone who's not connected to the grid and who otherwise would have very inferior or expensive sources of power to draw from, be it kerosene, which will make you sick, or...
Kerosene is like petrol?
Yeah, paraffin, kerosene.
Okay.
It's something you can burn in a, an old, it's like an old biblical lamp.
Okay. Where does kerosene come from?
Well, it's essentially petrol. It's a fossil fuel. Okay. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, in Africa there are 600 million, approximately, roughly, individuals who essentially use kerosene or candles to light their homes, and that equates to around, I think, or at least globally for those who use kerosene, to around 1.3 million barrels of oil, billion.
Okay, but then, like, if I'm in rural Kenya, like, is it like a petrol station? Like, where do I get kerosene?
Yeah, in the local markets, there's a whole distribution structure for kerosene. You can get that at most kiosks. Yeah. I
see. Cool. So it's something like a can.
It's a liquid. Sometimes you put into a water jug, and then you put it into the lamp itself, and then you light a little wick, and then it turns on.
Good. Okay, and so you're replacing that,
right? It's low brightness. If you're using a kerosene lamp, it's if you knock it over, you have the potential to burn your house down, and there's of course fumes that come out of it. So there's just that by itself is seen as an inferior source, and it's if you look at the kind of economics of this, you could look at a New Yorker with their light bulb on, and they're paying perhaps 80 times or 100 times less on a per unit basis of light and brightness of what this rural African is actually paying for light at home, in addition to the associated dangers that come with it, whether it's fire or health risks. And this really kind of traps the household. It's expensive. The parents will not leave their children to be more productive elsewhere, lest they turn it over and burn their house down. And because it's expensive and it's not so bright, it's really not conducive to a lot of productivity. And that's really a fundamental issue that is really hard to address, partly because the traditional model of addressing this is, of course, expanding the grid to these people who don't have electricity. Problem is, so much of Africa is pretty sparsely populated, one. Additionally, it's pretty expensive to expand the grid to these households. The copper, the wire that basically connects these households at that last mile is sometimes more expensive than the entire electrical appliances in the actual household. So it's just not very cost effective. And with population increase, you kind of never really catch up. So that number, 600 million Africans who are off grid, doesn't really change that much, because despite the grid being developed and expanding, the numbers of the population increase is also expanding at a similar rate. So it's really tough to tackle.
I see. All right. And so is this where the distributed economy comes in, would you say? Is in this? What's the sort of central idea around it?
Well, so this isn't my thinking. I think this is a bit more of our company's thinking. And, let me try my best also to kind of be an ambassador of this thesis. But, if you look at the conventional model of development and how do you really increase economic productivity, a kind of conventional model, at least if you were looking at Africa, would be, well, in the US, you used to have this really, sizable manufacturing base. And after a while, that became expensive. Where did you have a lot of labor force, but, where things were pretty cheap? Well, look at China. So now you move to China, Deng Xiaoping, that economy grows. A lot of cheap labor, boom, China has really grown. Economic productivity has really grown. After a while, even that might seem a little expensive. So then you might move to Southeast Asia. Well, what happens next? Maybe Africa is next. The problem, however, is, that worked, and maybe parts of that will work. We have a big labor force. We have a billion people, and you have about 3% annual increase of population. And indeed, when you look at the number, that would mean you have around 30 million people entering the job force or the labor force. But you really have about 5 million jobs being created every year. And yet somehow these economies are still growing. What we might not see is this kind of centralized economic development, whereby we really invest in cities because cities have the infrastructure for opportunity. People move typically from rural areas and come to cities to find opportunity. Why? Because there's a foundational layer of infrastructure. In cities, you will have sanitation. Typically, you will have access to food through these markets. You will have communication, and you will have power. Fantastic.
Power being like
electricity.
Yeah.
You'll have electricity, and then there's proximity to different items there, and it helps. But now, more and more, Azuri is looking to kind of replace that model, to disrupt that model, at least not make it necessary. You have 66% of, I think, the population in Africa living in rural areas where they actually have access to a lot of resources. I mean, just thinking of agriculture, one. But the biggest problem that they have is this lack of a foundational layer of infrastructure. They might not have electricity. They might not have very good access to water to be able to support their agriculture. They might not have good communication networks, such things as like satellite. This has been a real big problem, especially 20 years ago when you didn't even have a mobile network. Now, when the cell phones came in, cell phones being 10, 20 years old technology, it really revolutionized a lot of rural Africa, especially in Kenya. Let's use Kenya as an example. It filled the first one of many lacks in this foundational infrastructure requirements that you need for productivity, and that was communication. I mean, I think it's now 40%. Yeah, virtually all Kenyans, a high percentage of Kenyans have mobile phones now. And that really has, leapfrogged across over landlines. And then with that came financial services, M-Pesa. M-Pesa being really innovated here in Kenya. I think now 40% of the Kenyan GDP runs through mobile money platforms like M-Pesa here in Kenya. So it's pretty phenomenal. But what's kind of jarring, and this is where Azuri likes to come in, is you might have a situation where children have smartphones, or let's just say regular mobile phones, but are using technology to light their homes to study at night. That's been around for 1,000 years, this kind of kerosene type lamps. So Azuri is looking to utilize this mobile phone platform. What we do is we distribute these solar home systems to these households, and we provide them with extra layers of the infrastructure that they require to be more productive and essentially to have a better life. So right now, if a rural off-grid Kenyan consumer wants to charge their phone and they're currently using, and they're not connected to the grid, they'll have to often go to the market and pay someone at the market to charge their phone. The market itself might be grid connected, or they might have a generator somehow, maybe charge car batteries or just charge directly these mobile phones. And that's, of course, a cost of time for the consumer to go to the market, plus they have to pay around and wait and come back. And it just kind of limits the opportunity. Now, with these solar home systems, we can give these systems to these households. They can charge their phones at home, but now they have light at home as well. And with this light, typically, even at the very bottom of this pyramid, you see increases in productivity. You see children studying more. You see greater health effects, but you also see working hours extending into the, you have more time to cultivate or process agriculture. You have more time to be open with your kiosk, if you like. And that gives you now the element, it's a boost up. With this, typically we see higher incomes, which means that they're already being more productive and now can consume and spend more. After a while, Azuri now is providing, for example, this TV system. So now they can kind of tap into this new system. And from that, typically we would see higher rates of productivity as well. Next things down the line would be things like irrigation, solar irrigation pumps, potentially, or even greater productive use items. So things you might use actually at businesses, at bars, at restaurants, things like that. So this has been a pretty roundabout way of describing a little bit, not yet touching on what distributed economy might mean to us. But I think the thesis here is that in time, we are looking to provide the economic opportunity to rural Africans, giving them the digital tools to prevent or maybe mitigate the need for them to come all the way to the city to find their opportunities.
Good. Nice. Okay. So I'm sort of drawing conclusions here from or parallels from, in the UK, for example, Industrial Revolution, people just streaming in from rural town, and then ending up in the cities. Because that's, as you say, the only place where opportunity existed. You're saying that now people don't need to filter into the cities, and that they can almost stay at home to remain?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, yes, they still come, and this is kind of what we see might happen in the future. If we look at the gig economy in the West, like examples being, eDoctor, Uber, Airbnb.
This is where you don't have a formal employer, but you kind of just interact with these marketplaces and do little jobs.
Exactly. So because we think at Azuri that this kind of centralized economic development model, where if we look at power, let's use the traditional way of how to expand access to electricity. It's through this grid system. The idea would be you invest centrally somewhere and generate lots of gigawatts of power, whatever it may be, big dams, hydro or coal. And then all you do is you extend it out to reach ever more and more people. But because it's kind of centralized, people will come where there is power. And typically cities are powered that way. That's not very feasible in Africa, as we already touched on earlier today.
But you say that because the population is currently sparsely populated. But I mean, weren't most other parts of the world originally sparsely populated? Is there anything different in particular about Africa in that sense?
No, but therefore you have this huge urban migration, just the way we see it in Africa today. So we have Kibera, where someone who has probably some land in the rural countryside come all the way to Kibera.
Kibera is a slum in Nairobi.
Yes. Well, it might not be Kibera; it could be Mathare or others. And I don't want to represent Kibera wrongly here. But now they'll have to pay rent, they'll have to buy food, and they'll have to do something like what they might already be doing in where they came from, had they had the opportunities to, such as selling scratch cards for mobile money, SIM cards or something like that for telecom companies. Why couldn't they have done that there, where they already sit on some assets, essentially, their land, from which they can live off as well? Why can't we provide some of the opportunities there to do that? Why can't we do a miniature version of Uber in places that need, or handyman work in places where they already come from, instead of coming all the way to the cities to find these opportunities? So what we're trying to do is, over time, provide more of this foundational layer of support, infrastructural support. So while we might be now providing electricity and power, it's not just providing the power the way power used to be distributed in the past. If a government is now running or investing in lots of generation of gigawatts of power to distribute through a grid, that's fine and all. You essentially providing, and if you connect a consumer with this grid power, you're essentially allowing this consumer as much energy as they could ever use or need, because you have this huge source, gigawatts of power that you now have, that now connects to this consumer. And that's great if they can afford using this power, one. But two, sometimes, like currently here in Africa as well, many of the appliances that would be used with this power are too expensive. Azuri is not looking to be just a utility through a virtual, solar grid, essentially. What we're looking to do is provide what the grid can provide most efficiently to the consumers. So we're not looking at creating a lot of power that the consumer can't use. If you look actually in Kenya now, a very big percentage, especially of those who are connected, a big percentage of those who are connected to the grid are not actually using or paying KPLC, the Kenya Power. They just, either they feel like it's not very reliable, or they don't really have a need to, because the appliances that they don't have, one, or it's too expensive for them. But what they would need is what the appliances provide. So they're not really looking to pay a certain kilowatt hour of electricity. What they might want is actually light, or the ability to charge their phones, or the ability to water their plants or their crops. That's a little bit more easy. That's easier to value. So what Azuri is doing is, we're not just providing power, we're providing power with the appliances integrated to the system for them to then benefit from, with, of course, the financing.
Sure. Okay. And when it comes to, so we've kind of got this sort of, the old model was, the only way to generate power is to sort of have a big grid plant. I don't know the terminology, but you have to have it in a central place, and therefore you're saying that, almost like a magnet, other people then sort of gravitate around it. And you're saying that now you don't need to have one big magnet. You can have these little power sources, being distributed all over. What's the sort of, I don't know, what are the sort of implications of having that, having distributed power, and then sort of, does that mean that, you're going to have less sort of societies and countries are going to sort of develop in a different way than what they do currently? What I'm trying to get to is, like, for example, in the UK, London and other cities, those were the hubs of activity, really. And everyone would sort of flock there, and then as a result, you've then got all kinds of sort of activity that happens from having lots and lots and lots of people in the same place. Now, you're saying I'm interested in how that might play out if that doesn't.
It's a great question. I don't know if I can comment satisfactorily on that. I agree. I think having a lot of people in a similar place, there's a lot of benefits that can come from that in terms of cooperation and exchange, interactions, where you share ideas. But more and more the technologies that are coming and existing are helping to bridge that without having to be in a physical space. Right. So we're coming more and more to where communication is becoming very, very reliable. So you don't have to be in a physical place to be able to communicate, if that makes sense. Right. So 20 years ago, you couldn't really send money across Kenya very easily. Now you have M-Pesa, you can do that. And you can call them. And now with something like satellite television or with radio that's now distributed out, you don't have, that's another yet bridge. It's not replacing it. You cannot really replace. But I think there isn't going to be that same draw necessarily for this urban migration, because the robotics and artificial intelligence are replacing a lot of what manufacturers would have otherwise used, i.e. the labor force. If we can really think that Nairobi will be the next manufacturing hub for all kinds of cheap commodities globally, I'm not sure that will happen, partly because it's becoming cheaper to just do it still where it's being done. And that is also by replacing the humans that are doing it, either with robotics or with AI. I mean, there'll be a time in the next 20 years when maybe truck drivers, at least maybe not in Kenya, but elsewhere, will not be needed, right? What about cars, self-driving cars? We see that coming more and more. What is it? A lot of robotics that are being put into manufacturing companies in China will pay themselves back after a year. So does it now require this continual employment? Well, maybe the future is a bit more about this gig economy where there's services are provided. And we already see that in Kenya, where the vast majority of these informal jobs are service jobs. And why not allow that to happen? Just, continue that in the cities, but also allow that to happen in the more rural areas that already exist.
Okay, so you're kind of like saying how before it was, I currently have these, nice rural land that I'm living in, but the only way I'm going to progress is by moving to the city. And even though the option is I'm living in a slum and I've got very poor living conditions, that's the only option I've got in order to progress. You're saying with this base level of infrastructure, it's actually possible to progress without going into that area. And so actually people are going to be staying more.
Yeah, it's a base load. I mean, I think the kind of idea of what expanding the grid is like bringing a tank to give water to one person in the rural village, the one that was able to connect to the grid. That one person, a tank of water, who's really thirsty. That person might drink some water, but not require the rest of that water. But everyone else around could desperately use that water. So the way Azuri is kind of seeing itself is, instead of bringing a big tank of water to this one person, it's bringing just 1 cup of water to all these different individuals, and all of a sudden it satiates their thirst. They might not need 50 cups or a tank, but they need that 1 cup of water to be much better off just on the minimal level, right? After a while, they have that cup of water. You start giving them something else, and then they can be even more productive. So now you just grow in a distributed way, not in a centralized way, the opportunities or providing the needs of these consumers.
Got it. Are there any current examples of this type of development happening? So let's say we're saying that the distributed economy is kind of, the scene is set for it to be happening in Africa. Are there any other parts of the world where this type of development trajectory has already taken place, or elements of it have been done?
I don't know. I think that's a great question. I think this leads to this idea of reverse innovation. I think what we're doing here hasn't really been done, but might actually impact societies like the United States.
What is reverse innovation?
Well, yeah, so regular innovation might be something like Apple creates the iPhone, and then the iPhone ultimately becomes an H product and gets distributed, and you'll someday see it in rural Africa, an older generation iPhone. Reverse innovation might be you create something in rural Africa, and then in 20 years you see it in Silicon Valley. And I say that, with when you start seeing things like Solar City, applying, Azuri systems have AI in them. They monitor the usage of, it's a technology we call HomeSmart. They monitor the usage of our consumers, of how they use their lights, how they charge their phones, how they charge the other appliances that can be connected with USB. And it learns from them so that it can always try to maximize the experience of the consumer. Very rough example, you might have a consumer who likes to turn on their lights from 6 to 10 p.m., but always have an hour of light in the morning as well. If the system, by monitoring itself, notices that it doesn't have enough battery charge, for whatever reason, this is the risk you have with solar, it might not charge fully, doesn't have enough battery power for that one extra hour in the morning, it will slightly dim the lights to almost imperceptible levels to help ensure that that consumer will still benefit the way it normally benefits, or he or she normally benefits, with that 1 hour of light in the morning. That kind of practice we should be able to see happening more and more in Western societies when they start using solar technology as well. Another, might be just these flexible credit financing schemes. So PayGo is a pretty big innovation as well. It's not really lease to own. You really pay for it as you use it, but it's a weird, relatively hard to describe financing model or credit model. It's not really a loan. It's not really a conditional sale. Consumers, if they default, will have their units reclaimed, but there's nothing given back because they were using the systems as a service. But once they pay it enough times, that asset, the solar home system, becomes theirs. So this kind of new credit innovation is something that might also be applicable to the West. So it's bringing innovations from what we do here because of the needs here, and then seeing how it might actually apply in places like Silicon Valley as well.
I see. Do you think that the distributed economy thesis, based on how we just talked about reverse innovation, do you think that parts of the Western world might begin to turn in this way?
Yes, and I think we're seeing that as well. Partly because although we kind of poo-poo this term, the gig economy, it's kind of what that means. It's allowing someone who might be in rural Iowa to be able to rent out their room and make some income if someone ever passes by, on I-80 traveling through. I don't know if the I-80 goes through Iowa, but I think the development of the more informal sector where we don't really have an employment kind of legal category in the US. Are they employees? Are they consultants? They're freelancers. Do they get benefits? Who gives them the benefits? All these kind of things. It hasn't really existed, but it's clearly becoming a hot topic. That's moving things. That's really disrupting things, to use an overused term. So I do think we'll see more and more of that as well, in a different kind of vein or a taste or perspective. But that's happening as well. Yeah.
Cool. And so that would say that big megacities would recede? I
don't know. I think cities, I think I'd have to have a lot of hubris to claim that cities will contract, looking at the trends of urbanization. But I think what it means is that opportunities for more rural areas are increasing because things like power, mobile phone networks. So if you have 4G, 5G in rural areas in the US, allows you to do more. If you can have broadband internet in those areas, allows you to do more without having to move to the city. So therefore, you might have a little bit less need to move to the city. If that makes sense. It might not stop it, and it may never stop it. But
when you look at the services that you feel are required to sort of give people this sort of base level of infrastructure, what's the most difficult thing? What's like the really tricky one where you're like, I'm kind of imagining you've got your whiteboard and you're like, right, okay, we've got mobile phones, tick. People can communicate. Electricity, with people giving people solar systems, that's a tick. what are some of the other, what are the other main ones? If you had to sort of just spell it out in like one or two words, and then which one are you like, man, that's a really tough one. How are we going to crack that?
Great question. Well, I work on the operations side.
Don't go evade the question.
And what would be, I think, for example, we as a company, we might see more challenges in providing irrigation because there's such a diversity of needs in irrigation, and there's a huge educational component that's required with irrigation. The whole agronomy aspect. So you're not just distributing a solar home system, with the premium appliances, with the credit, and with the power, but you can also have to really distribute the knowledge as well. And you can do that maybe through the TV. You give a USB drive. This consumer has a TV system that they've already paid off, and then it has like hours and hours of agronomy content. You want to make sure that they are empowered, because if they don't know how to use the system that you've given them, they're not going to pay for it. So that kind of goes against our commercial reasons. So I think irrigation, down the line as we develop it, is a difficult one. But if we talk simply about the distribution aspect of it, I think a traditional challenge for all pay-go companies in some way or another has been the working capital financing. Why? You need someone somehow to pay for these systems up front. To get your earnings, you're going to have to wait until the consumers pay back their, quote unquote loan. But you don't want to wait for them to pay back to be able to generate more systems. So you need to find some sort of way to sustainably grow your working capital and your asset financing, both really, to grow. And
in simple terms, so how much does it cost roughly for you to provide? Let's talk about the premium one. Let's talk about the TV one. What's the upfront cash cost it costs you to dump that in and give that to someone's home?
I don't.
Let's say, for example, $200, for example.
Okay.
How long does it take for you to then for the customer to pay back, and then do they pay back X% extra?
Right. Yeah. It depends on the system, on the contracts, the term, the payment periods that the customers may pick. There's a bit of flexibility there. Also, because it's not a term loan, it might be a percentage of the contract. Okay, it's a little tough. Let's say a customer signs up for a year and a half, or let's say a year for argument's sake. Let's say 12 months. Because it's pay as you go, they only use it when they pay for it.
Oh, so they go on holiday for 2 weeks.
Exactly.
They go away for 2 weeks.
And if they go for too long, in Azuri's case, well, we'll have to go in and reclaim the system. Some may not reclaim systems, but we kind of try to have that element in there as well. So it might take 20% longer, right? And now you have to account for the financing cost extra, because there's extra interest that you've been waiting to pay back. So it's a little bit hard to say. Maybe let's say 60% of the contract. Once they get to 60%, you basically have your costs paid for, and then the rest can maybe become the margin to reinvest. But that's really rough.
Okay. But it's not something where you're sweating away for 2 years and you make 5%. There's some decent return there if you need to, yeah.
Absolutely. And I think the way Azuri's been trying to do it is sustainably grow. So be unit economic profitable from the beginning. So, raise not that much funds, not a lot of equity, maybe some loans, and make sure that these earnings are coming back. And if we stop growing, we would still make a profit, kind of thing. If we had raised a lot of equity and then we stopped performing, we'd have all this, we'd have all of our investors say, well, where's our return? So there's an element of that. Yeah.
Okay. So we'll just finish up with a few last questions. Now, we've spoken sort of a lot about sort of how things might sort of play out and things. I was wondering, could you sort of paint a distributed economy utopia of what the world might look like in 10 years? Or at least let's say imagine, kind of a lot of the logistics kind of side of things kind of get sorted. What might things look like in terms of, if everything sort of came together?
That's a good question. I think what will happen, so the African population, if I'm looking at Africa, let's say I'm very Kenya based and focused, but if you look at Africa, there's a pretty big population increase right now, right? And that is great if this population increase, this labor force, will be able to be productive down the line. The moment the population rate slows down and you have productive, a productive economy, you get this, kind of demographic dividend. So right now, if you have a few of the older individuals in a population kind of taking care of a lot of dependables, so a lot of individuals that are younger at the bottom, and with population increase, you want to make sure ultimately that those who become older are productive. And then the moment that the population rate decreases, you're going to have a lot more economic productivity at the top end. So what we're looking, hopefully, is to ensure that economic productivity grows everywhere, that we can bridge the digital divide into the rural areas to help make that happen. And I think the distributed economy can help us get there.
Okay. So, of course, you're saying that there are more. So at the moment, for example, in Uganda, I think it is, the median age is 15, right? And so half the population are sort of 15 and younger. Mm-hmm. So you're saying that when these people then sort of enter the workforce, you're saying that so long as those people are productive and they're being able to sort of go to contribute to the economy, you're saying that once that slows down and the number of young people essentially reduces, you've then, by percentage, more of your population are contributing economically to the country or to the society. Yeah. But you're saying that the big condition on that is they've got things which they can contribute to. Is that somewhat out of Azuri's control, or are you saying that sort of regardless, that by giving people these tools, they'll be able to?
I think on first findings, we see productivity increasing even on the most basic services that are provided. And then, of course, productivity is a sense, just a lot of exchanges and interactions and transactions. And the more we enable that to happen. So as a small example, I think in Ethiopia, there were some academics who tried to do some studies of how they showed some of these different villages, what can happen if you were successful with agriculture, for example. Then they showed another control group or placebo group entertainment programs, and then a control group where they did nothing. Simply by showing what can happen what you can achieve without NGO helped increase this kind of aspirational behavior to actually do some of this stuff. So all of a sudden, the economic growth of this one treatment group grew after 6 months and a year, despite and compared to the other control groups. So the moment you provide a little bit of an incentive, a little bit of a motivation, a little bit of an aspiration, people will tend to act on that and then actually grow economically and productively.
Okay, got it. And when you look at, what I'm trying to get to is sort of, you're saying current house, potentially kerosene lamps, this sort of, and what does almost the home of the rural home of the future, I'm guessing from what we're saying, people will still be living in rural. What might it look like in Utopia in 10 years?
I'm not quite sure. But
what? You can't tell me?
But let's say something like, you're going to have, maybe you have an artist who now, was able to finance his own camera or computer and has broadband internet, never needed to leave, is connected through his communication abilities to provide graphic design or branding work as a consultant for someone in Uganda from Kenya, and he never had to leave. The broadband internet is another next thing. Why? How has he been able to do that? Well, he's got the communication infrastructure, he's got the power. With very efficient appliances, he's able to run his solar powered computer, his refrigeration, and he's got also access to land, which he's been able to cultivate much better, and that has enabled an increase in incomes that now has been able to fund education for his children or her children, right? And they're following their dreams, right? They are able to produce without, in this kind of techie way, without having to have left their home. Now, if they wanted to leave their home, let's not stop them, of course, but they don't have to. Would be the idea.
I think that's the bit which is always yeah, I think for me that's the crux of it. Is like, yeah, the fact how you don't need to, because I'm generally quite pro cities in terms of, you know, the exchange of ideas and all that sort of stuff. But as you say, it's just not having to need to go there, but you can have it, yeah, more in that sense. Very cool. Well, Conrad, people who are listening at home, how can they sort of learn a bit more about you and a bit more about Azuri and, yeah, perhaps more about this?
Yeah, I mean, I think, check us out on Twitter, on Facebook. I'd have to review the handles on that. But www.azuri-technologies.com will be a great starting point.
Great stuff. Well, I'll pop that all in the show notes.
Cool.
Well, Conrad, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Before we head, just a quick moment to say thank you for listening. You can see show notes for this episode by heading to www.samfloy.com/podcast. That's samfloy.com/podcast. If you'd like to learn more about the podcast and stay updated on future episodes, as well as a few other things like behind-the-scenes pictures, then please check out our Facebook page. Search for the East Africa Business Podcast, and you can like it from there. Finally, if you felt this was a good episode, then please do leave a rating for the show on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. It helps others like you find the show, and I, for one, would really appreciate it. In any case, have a great week and speak to you soon.